Friends, today, we are going to talk about something that touches almost every family, every home, and perhaps every generation. The title of our video is, What does Gen Z really want their parents and elders to understand? It sounds like a simple question. But behind this question lies a much deeper problem: the growing gap between generations. Today, parents and elders often look at Gen Z and wonder, why are young people so different today? Why don't they think the way we used to? Why do they question traditions and old ways of doing things? Why do they seem so dependent on technology? And sometimes, the conclusion becomes, young people today simply don't understand life. But on the other side, Gen Z is asking its own questions. They wonder, why don't our parents understand the world we are growing up in? Why are we constantly compared with the way things were in their time? Why are our emotional struggles sometimes dismissed as weakness? Why are our choices treated as disobedience simply because they are different? Why do we receive advice when what we really want is to be heard? And this is where the real problem begins. Both generations feel misunderstood. Parents and elders may feel, we sacrificed everything for our children. Why don't they appreciate it? While Gen Z may feel, we appreciate what you have done for us. But why don't you understand what we are going through? One generation speaks from experience. The other speaks from a rapidly changing reality. One says, we learned life the hard way. The other says, but the world we are living in is different. And perhaps the truth is, neither generation is completely wrong. The older generation has something Gen Z desperately needs: experience, patience, perspective, and wisdom gained through real life. And Gen Z has something older generations can learn from: new ideas, technological awareness, adaptability, and a different understanding of the changing world. Yet, instead of learning from one another, they sometimes end up arguing with one another. Parents feel ignored. Young people feel unheard. Elders feel disrespected. Young people feel judged. And slowly, love remains, but communication begins to disappear. Friends, this is not a battle between old and young. It is not about deciding who is right and who is wrong. It is about understanding why two generations, who often love each other deeply, can sometimes feel like they are living on completely different planets. And perhaps the most important question is not, who should change? The better question is, how can both generations understand each other better? Because Gen Z doesn't necessarily want their parents and elders to agree with everything they do. And parents and elders don't necessarily need to agree with every choice Gen Z makes. But perhaps both sides want the same fundamental things: respect, understanding, acceptance, guidance, freedom, and above all, love without judgment. So, friends, let's take a step back from the arguments, the stereotypes, and the phrase in our time, and genuinely listen to what Gen Z may be trying to say. Because this isn't just a message from Gen Z to the older generation. It can also become a message from the older generation to General Z, and perhaps, somewhere between the wisdom of yesterday and the possibilities of tomorrow, we can find a better way to understand each other. So, let's begin. What does Gen Z really want their parents and elders to understand?
Point number 1. They don't want to be judged before they are understood. Friends, perhaps the first and most important thing Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand is very simple. They don't want to be judged before they are understood. Before saying, you are wrong, before saying, young people today are too sensitive, before saying, in our time, we never behaved like this. Perhaps we should pause and ask, why do they think this way? Every generation grows up under different circumstances. The world that shaped today's parents and grandparents is not the same world that is shaping General Z. They are growing up surrounded by smartphones, social media, artificial intelligence, instant communication, intense competition, rapidly changing careers, and an enormous flow of information. Their problems may look different. Their choices may look different. Even their definition of success may be different. But different does not necessarily mean wrong. And this is where misunderstanding often begins. A young person may say, I don't want to follow this career. An elder may immediately think, they are irresponsible. A young person may say, I need some time for myself. An elder may interpret it as, they don't respect the family. A young person may express emotional exhaustion and say, I'm struggling. Someone may respond, we faced much harder times. What do you have to worry about? But comparing someone's pain with our own does not make their pain disappear. Friends, there is a profound difference between judging a person's behavior and understanding the person behind that behavior. Perhaps a young person who seems distant is not disrespectful. Maybe they are confused. Perhaps the young person who seems unmotivated is not lazy. Maybe they are struggling to find purpose. Perhaps the young person who questions tradition is not rejecting their family. Maybe they simply want to understand why a tradition exists. And perhaps the young person who disagrees with an elder is not trying to challenge authority. Maybe they are simply trying to find their own voice. Of course, Gen Z can make mistakes. They can make poor choices. They can be impatient. They can misunderstand things, just like every generation before them. But making mistakes is part of being human. And if every mistake is immediately met with criticism, comparison, or humiliation, young people may eventually stop sharing their thoughts altogether. They may still live in the same house. They may still sit at the same dinner table. They may still say, "Yes, Dad," or "Yes, Mom." But emotionally, they may begin to move away. And that is something every family should be careful about. Because silence is not always respect. Sometimes, silence is a sign that someone has stopped feeling safe enough to speak. So perhaps the next time a young person says something we don't understand, instead of immediately asking, "What's wrong with you?" we could ask, "Help me understand." Instead of saying, "You youngsters know nothing about life," we could say, "Tell me what life looks like from your perspective." And instead of beginning with judgment, begin with curiosity. Because listening does not mean agreeing. Understanding does not mean approving. And respecting someone's feelings does not mean accepting every decision they make. It simply means giving another human being the dignity of being heard before being judged. Friends, perhaps Gen Z isn't asking their parents and elders to become younger. They aren't asking them to understand every trend, every app, every opinion, or every choice. They may simply be asking for something much more basic. Before you judge me, please try to understand me. And sometimes, those few seconds of listening can prevent years of misunderstanding. Because every young person wants guidance. But before they can receive guidance, they want to feel heard.
Point number 2. In our time is not always an answer. There is a sentence that has been repeated by generations of parents, grandparents, teachers, and elders, in our time. And usually, it comes from experience. It may begin with, "In our time, we didn't have all these facilities." "In our time, children respected their elders." "In our time, we worked much harder." "In our time, people were more patient." And perhaps many of these things are true. Previous generations lived through difficult circumstances. They learned to manage with less, endure hardship, accept responsibility, and keep moving forward even when life was difficult. Their experiences deserve respect, but there is one important question we must ask. Can the lessons of yesterday always provide the answers for the problems of today? The world has changed. The workplace has changed. Technology has changed. Education has changed. Communication has changed. Relationships have changed. Even the meaning of success is changing. A young person today may be facing problems that simply did not exist when their parents were young. They may be dealing with constant digital distractions, social media pressure, information overload, uncertainty about careers, artificial intelligence, intense competition, and the pressure of watching thousands of other people's seemingly perfect lives every day. So when a young person says, "I'm struggling," telling them, "We had it much harder," may be true, but it doesn't necessarily help them with the struggle they are facing today. Because pain is not a competition. One generation's suffering does not make another generation's suffering insignificant. And this is where wisdom becomes important. Wisdom is not simply saying, "We did it this way, so you must do it this way too." Wisdom is knowing which lessons from the past are timeless, and which solutions belonged only to the circumstances of that time. A young person may not need to hear, "When I was your age, I." They may need to hear, "When I was your age, this is what I learned." But tell me, what are you facing today? That small difference can change everything. Because experience should be a bridge, not a wall. The older generation has traveled a road that the younger generation has not. That experience is valuable, but the younger generation is traveling a road that the older generation has never traveled before. And that reality is valuable too. The goal should not be to make Gen Z live exactly as previous generations lived. Nor should Gen Z dismiss everything that previous generations learned. Instead, the past should become wisdom for the future, not a prison for the present. Perhaps the most powerful thing an elder can say is not, "In our time, we did it this way." But, "This is what my experience taught me." Take what is useful, and show me what is different about your world. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Because the world changes, but the purpose of wisdom remains the same, to help the next generation live better than the previous one. And perhaps that is the true meaning of passing wisdom from one generation to another, not giving young people the exact answers we received, but giving them the understanding, courage, and judgment to find the right answers for their own time.
Point number 3. They want advice but not control. There is a beautiful difference between guiding someone and controlling them, and perhaps this is one of the most important things Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand. Young people don't necessarily reject advice. In fact, many of them need it. They need the wisdom of those who have already traveled through life. They need someone who can say, "I've been through something similar. Let me tell you what I learned." But there is a difference between saying, "Here's what I have learned," and saying, "You must do exactly what I say." The first is guidance. The second is control. And when advice becomes control, even good advice can become difficult to accept. Parents and elders often try to control because they care. They have seen disappointment. They have experienced failure. They know how painful some mistakes can be. And naturally, they want to protect the young people they love from making those same mistakes. But there is a difficult truth about growing up. You cannot protect someone from every mistake without also protecting them from experience. A young person needs opportunities to make choices, to make mistakes, to learn, to change direction, to discover what works and what doesn't. Imagine a parent telling a young person, "You should become a doctor." The intention may be love. Perhaps the parent wants financial security, respect, and a better future for their child. But what if the young person dreams of becoming a designer, an entrepreneur, a teacher, a filmmaker, a researcher, or something that doesn't even have a name yet? The parent may see uncertainty. The young person may see possibility. And neither necessarily sees the entire picture. This is why guidance matters. Instead of saying, "This is what you are going to do," perhaps say, "Have you thought about the advantages and disadvantages?" Instead of, "Don't make that decision," perhaps say, "Let me tell you what worries me about that decision." Instead of, "Because I know better," perhaps say, "I have more experience, but you know your circumstances better than I do." That doesn't weaken parental authority. It strengthens the relationship, because when young people feel that their choices are respected, they are often more willing to listen to advice. But when every conversation feels like an order, they may stop listening altogether. And there is another important distinction. Freedom does not mean the absence of boundaries. Young people still need responsibility. They need consequences. They need discipline. They need people who are willing to tell them uncomfortable truths. But discipline can exist without humiliation. Boundaries can exist without domination. And advice can exist without control. Perhaps the healthiest relationship between generations is not, "I decide everything for you." Nor is it, "You can do absolutely anything you want." It is, "I will guide you, but I will also allow you to grow." Because the purpose of parenting is not to keep a child dependent forever. It is to gradually prepare that child to stand independently. A wise elder does not always walk in front of a young person, choosing every direction. Sometimes they walk beside them, sometimes they walk behind them, and sometimes they step back completely, while remaining close enough to help when needed. That is not abandonment, that is trust. And perhaps what Gen Z wants most is not freedom from guidance, but freedom within guidance. They want to know, "You can advise me without controlling me. You can disagree with me without rejecting me. You can warn me without taking away my right to choose." Because one day, every young person must become responsible for their own life. And when that day comes, the greatest gift an elder can give is not a life designed for them, but the wisdom and confidence to design a meaningful life for themselves. Guide them, protect them when necessary, warn them when they are heading toward danger, but also, trust them enough to let them become who they are capable of becoming.
Point number 4. They want their mental and emotional struggles taken seriously. Perhaps one of the most important things Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand is this: not every struggle can be seen from the outside. A young person may be smiling, going to college or work, talking to family, using their phone, meeting people, and apparently living a normal life. Yet, inside, they may be carrying worries that nobody can see. They may feel overwhelmed, confused, lonely, exhausted, uncertain about the future, or simply unable to explain what is happening inside them. And sometimes, when they finally gather the courage to say, "I'm not okay," the response they receive is, "Everyone has problems." Or, "You are young. What do you have to worry about?" Or perhaps, "We faced much harder times than you." These words may be spoken with good intentions, but they can unintentionally make a young person feel that their feelings are not important. Because suffering is not a competition. Someone else's hardship does not make your hardship meaningless. A person doesn't have to experience the worst problem in the world before they are allowed to say, I'm struggling. And emotional pain is not always visible. A broken bone can be seen. A physical wound can be examined. But loneliness, anxiety, fear, burnout, grief, confusion, and emotional exhaustion may remain completely invisible. That is why sometimes the most important thing an elder can do is not give an immediate solution. It is simply to listen. When a young person says, I'm under too much pressure, perhaps don't immediately say, be strong. Instead, ask, what is putting you under so much pressure? When they say, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, don't immediately respond, you need to work harder. Perhaps say, it's okay not to have everything figured out yet. Let's talk about it. And when they say, I feel alone, don't dismiss it simply because people are physically around them. Because a person can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel completely alone. Sometimes young people aren't looking for someone to solve their entire life. They are looking for someone who will sit beside them, without judging them, without comparing them, without immediately turning their pain into a lecture. They may simply need to hear, I'm here. Tell me what you're going through. You don't have to pretend that everything is fine. Those words may sound simple. But when someone has been carrying their emotions silently, being heard can feel like finally putting down a burden they have carried for far too long. And this doesn't mean that every feeling should determine every decision. It doesn't mean young people should be protected from every difficulty. Life will always contain challenges. Resilience still matters. Discipline still matters. Responsibility still matters. But resilience does not mean pretending that nothing hurts. Being strong does not mean being silent. Sometimes strength means having the courage to say, I need help. And sometimes the greatest strength an elder can show is responding, you don't have to face this alone. There is also something important for Gen Z to understand. Parents and elders may not always know how to talk about emotions. Many grew up in environments where feelings were rarely discussed. They may have been taught to hide their pain, to keep moving, to provide for their families, and to solve problems rather than talk about them. So when they don't immediately understand emotional struggles, it doesn't always mean they don't care. Sometimes, they simply don't know how to respond. And that is where both generations can learn from each other. Young people can learn to communicate their feelings with patience. Older generations can learn to listen without immediately judging or dismissing them. Because emotional understanding is not a weakness of one generation. It is a skill every generation can learn. And perhaps the greatest change begins when a parent stops asking, why are you feeling this way? As if the feeling itself is a problem, and starts asking, what happened that made you feel this way? That one question opens a door. A door to conversation. A door to trust. A door to understanding. And sometimes, that door is all someone needs. Because beneath the modern language of mental and emotional well-being is an ancient human need. To be seen, to be heard, and to know that our pain matters to someone. So perhaps Gen Z is not asking their parents and elders to understand every emotion perfectly. They are asking for something much simpler. Take us seriously when we say we're struggling. Listen before you lecture. Understand before you judge. Support before you criticize. And when you don't know what to say, sometimes, simply saying, I'm here, tell me, can be more powerful than 1,000 words of advice.
Point number 5. They don't want their entire generation labeled lazy. There is a word that can hurt more than many people realize, lazy. And when that word is used to describe an entire generation, it can create a wall between young people and those who are trying to understand them. Some parents and elders look at Gen Z and see young people who spend hours on smartphones, prefer flexible work, question traditional careers, or seem less willing to accept exhausting working conditions. And the conclusion can sometimes be, this generation doesn't want to work. But is that really the whole story? Perhaps not, because different does not automatically mean lazy. Previous generations often grew up with a very specific understanding of hard work. Wake up early, go to work, work long hours, stay with one organization, build a stable career, buy a house, support the family, retire. For many people, that path represented security and success. And there is great dignity in that kind of hard work. But Gen Z has entered a world where the traditional path is being questioned. They have seen people work for decades and still struggle financially. They have watched technology transform entire industries. They have seen remote work become possible. They have discovered new forms of entrepreneurship. They have witnessed people build careers through skills that didn't exist in previous generations. So some of them are asking a very different question. Do I have to sacrifice my entire life to prove that I am hardworking? That question should not automatically be interpreted as laziness. Sometimes it is a question about purpose. A young person may not want to work 14 hours a day simply because 14 hours sounds more impressive than 8. They may ask, what am I actually accomplishing? Is this work meaningful? Can I have a career and still have a life? Can I earn a living without destroying my health, relationships, and peace of mind? These are legitimate questions, and perhaps there is something older generations and younger generations can learn from each other here. Older generations can teach Gen Z the value of discipline, patience, persistence, delayed gratification, showing up even when motivation disappears. Because success is rarely built on motivation alone, sometimes you simply have to keep going. But Gen Z can also remind older generations of something equally important: life is more than work. A career is important, money is important, responsibility is important, but so are family, health, relationships, personal growth, creativity, rest, and time. The real question may not be, who works harder? The better question is, how can we work wisely while still living meaningfully? There is also a danger in labeling an entire generation. When we repeatedly tell young people, you're lazy, they may eventually stop hearing the concern behind the words. They hear only rejection, and once someone feels that they are already being judged, they become less willing to explain themselves. Instead of, you're lazy, perhaps ask, what motivates you? Instead of, you don't want to work, ask, what kind of work do you want to do? Instead of, you're wasting your life, ask, what are you hoping to build with your life? Those questions create a conversation, and perhaps that conversation will reveal something surprising. The young person may actually have enormous ambition. They may simply be pursuing it differently. They may want to create a business, learn technology, build something online, become a content creator, develop a specialized skill, work independently, travel while working, or pursue a career that didn't exist when their parents were young. That doesn't guarantee success, of course. Dreams still require discipline, ideas still require execution, freedom still requires responsibility, and Gen Z should never confuse flexibility with entitlement or work-life balance with avoiding hard work. Because no generation can escape effort. Every meaningful achievement demands sacrifice. The difference is that Gen Z may be asking, can we choose what is worth sacrificing for? And perhaps that is a question worth listening to. Because the opposite of laziness is not exhaustion. The opposite of laziness is purposeful action. A person can work 16 hours a day and still be moving in the wrong direction. Another person can work 8 focused hours, continue learning, build something meaningful, and create a sustainable life. The number of hours alone doesn't tell the whole story. What matters is effort, discipline, direction, responsibility, and purpose. So perhaps the older generation doesn't need to stop teaching Gen Z how to work hard. They simply need to make sure the lesson is not reduced to, work harder because we did. And Gen Z doesn't need to reject the work ethic of previous generations. They can carry forward the discipline, while questioning the unnecessary sacrifices. They can embrace ambition, without glorifying burnout. They can pursue success, without believing that their worth depends entirely on productivity. Because ultimately, a person's value cannot be measured by how exhausted they are at the end of the day. Hard work matters, but meaningful work matters too. And perhaps the greatest lesson for both generations is this: don't judge someone's work ethic simply because they are building their life differently from you. Look beyond the screen, look beyond the lifestyle, look beyond the stereotypes, and ask the deeper question: what is this young person trying to become? Because sometimes, what looks like laziness from the outside may actually be a young person searching for a better way to live, work, and build a meaningful future.
Point number 6. They want to be respected as individuals. One of the simplest things Gen Z may want from their parents and elders is also one of the most fundamental. Please see me as an individual. Not simply as a member of a generation. Not as a stereotype. Not as today's children. But as a unique human being, with a unique personality, unique dreams, unique fears, unique abilities, and a unique path through life. Every generation contains millions of different people. So when we say, Gen Z is like this, or young people today always do that, we may already be making a mistake. Because there is no single Gen Z personality. Some are ambitious, some are quiet, some are adventurous, some are deeply traditional, some are creative, some are highly academic, some want to become entrepreneurs, some want stable jobs, some dream of changing the world, and some simply want a peaceful, meaningful life. They are individuals before they are a generation. And this matters especially within families. Imagine a young person who loves art being told, art is not a real career. A young person who wants to become an entrepreneur being told, get a safe job like everyone else. A quiet young person being told, why can't you be more confident like your cousin? Or a young person with completely different interests being asked, why can't you be more like your brother? These statements may be intended as guidance, but sometimes they communicate something very different. Who you naturally are is not good enough. And that can be deeply discouraging, because every young person eventually has to answer one of life's most important questions, who am I? And discovering the answer takes time. It requires exploration, it requires mistakes, it requires trying things that don't work, it requires changing one's mind, it requires discovering strengths that may not have been obvious at first. And sometimes, it requires walking a path that nobody else in the family has walked before. That can be frightening for parents. When a child chooses an unfamiliar path, parents may see risk. But the young person may see possibility. And perhaps the answer isn't to eliminate the risk, but to help the young person understand it. There is a difference between saying, I don't understand your choice, and saying, your choice is wrong. There is a difference between, I'm worried about your future, and, you will never succeed. There is a difference between, have you considered another option, and, you must become what I want you to become. The first creates dialogue, the second can slowly destroy confidence. Parents and elders naturally have dreams for the young people they love. They may imagine a particular career, a particular lifestyle, a particular definition of success. And those dreams often come from love. But there is a beautiful truth about raising another human being. You are not creating a copy of yourself. You are helping another individual discover who they can become. A child is not a family project. A young person is not a trophy. Their life is not a competition between families. And their worth should never depend on how closely they resemble someone else's idea of success. Perhaps one of the greatest gifts an elder can give is the freedom to say, I don't completely understand your path yet, but I want to understand you. That sentence can change a relationship. Because respect doesn't require agreement. Parents can disagree with a career choice. Elders can question a decision. Families can have different values. But disagreement does not have to become rejection. A young person can hear, I disagree with you, and still feel, they believe in me. That distinction is enormously important. Because when young people feel respected as individuals, they are more likely to develop something far more valuable than obedience, responsibility. They begin to think for themselves. They learn to evaluate consequences. They become capable of making decisions. And eventually, they develop the confidence to stand on their own. Perhaps Gen Z is not asking their parents and elders to accept every choice without question. They are asking for something more meaningful. Let me be myself while I learn how to become my best self. Don't compare me with everyone else. Don't define me by my generation. Don't assume you already know what I want. Ask me, listen to me, give me room to grow. And if my path looks different from yours, don't assume that different means wrong. Because the world needs people who are willing to become themselves. And sometimes, the greatest thing an elder can say to a young person is not, become like me. But, become the best version of yourself.
Point number 7. They want to be taken seriously when they talk about money. Money is one of those subjects that can quietly create a generation gap. Older generations may remember a time when the path to financial security seemed relatively straightforward. Study hard. Get a stable job, work hard, save money, buy a home, support your family. For many people, that formula worked, and the lessons behind it are still valuable. But Gen Z is entering adulthood in a very different economic reality. For many young people, the questions surrounding money are not simply, how much can I earn? They are, how can I afford the life I want? How do I become financially independent? Will my career remain secure? How will technology and artificial intelligence change my job? Should I pursue a traditional career or build something of my own? How can I save when so much of my income is already going toward everyday expenses? These are serious questions, and when young people talk about money, they don't always want another lecture about spending less. Sometimes, they want someone to understand the financial world they are entering. A young person may hear, when I was your age, I managed with much less. And perhaps that is true. But the comparison may not tell the whole story. Different generations have faced different costs, different opportunities, different technologies, different job markets, and different expectations. So when Gen Z talks about financial pressure, dismissing the concern with, we survived, so you will too, may close the conversation instead of opening it. What they may need is not judgment, but financial wisdom. Because older generations have something extremely valuable to offer: experience. They know what it means to live within one's means. They understand the importance of saving. They know the danger of unnecessary debt. They have learned that appearances can be expensive, and that financial security is often built quietly, over many years. These lessons are priceless, but they become much more powerful when they are shared as guidance rather than criticism. Instead of saying, "You young people waste all your money," perhaps ask, "What are your biggest financial concerns?" Instead of saying, "You should have bought a house by now," perhaps ask, "What are your financial goals?" Instead of saying, "Just get a government job," perhaps discuss the possibilities and risks of different career paths. Because the financial world is changing. A young person today may earn money through a traditional job, freelancing, online business, content creation, digital services, entrepreneurship, or professions that didn't even exist a generation ago. That doesn't mean every new opportunity is wise. Some are risky, some are temporary, some are scams, and some require skills, patience, and years of effort before they produce meaningful income. This is precisely where generations can help each other. Gen Z can bring new ideas and digital awareness. Older generations can bring financial discipline and long-term perspective. One understands the new possibilities. The other understands the consequences of financial decisions made over time. Imagine what could happen if these strengths were combined. Instead of, "Your generation doesn't understand money," we hear, "Let's learn how this new economy works together." Instead of, "You don't know what you're doing," we hear, "Let me share what I learned from my financial mistakes." And instead of hiding financial difficulties out of embarrassment, young people feel comfortable asking questions. Because money should not be a subject surrounded by shame. It should be a subject surrounded by knowledge. Gen Z also needs to hear something important. Financial independence requires more than earning money. It requires discipline. It requires patience. It requires learning. It requires distinguishing between what you want and what you actually need. It requires understanding that a higher income does not automatically create financial freedom if spending rises just as quickly. And perhaps one of the most important lessons is this: don't measure your financial success by how impressive your life looks to other people. A luxury lifestyle can be financed by debt. A simple lifestyle can hide enormous financial security. What matters is not always what people can see. It is what you are building beneath the surface. Savings, skills, investments, emergency security, freedom of choice, and peace of mind. So when Gen Z talks about money, perhaps the message isn't, "Give us money." It may be, "Take our financial concerns seriously. Listen to our questions. Help us understand what you learned. Tell us about the mistakes you made. Teach us how to build, not merely how to spend. And give us the confidence to create financial security in a world that is changing rapidly." Because money is not simply about wealth. It is about choices. It is about security. It is about independence. And ultimately, it is about having enough control over your financial life to live according to your values. Perhaps the greatest financial conversation between generations is not about who had it harder. It is about asking, what can we learn from each other so that the next generation can build a more secure future? That is a conversation worth having.
Point number 8. They want older generations to understand their digital world. For Gen Z, the digital world is not simply a place they visit. It is the world in which they grew up. For many older generations, the internet arrived as a new technology. For Gen Z, it was already there. Smartphones, social media, online education, video platforms, digital payments, gaming, instant messaging, artificial intelligence and online communities have become part of everyday life. So when an older person says, "Why are you always on your phone?" the question may be understandable. But to a young person, that phone may represent much more than entertainment. It may be their classroom, their workplace, their communication system, their source of information, their creative studio, their social connection, their business opportunity, and sometimes, even their emotional support network. Of course, that doesn't mean everything happening online is healthy. Far from it. The digital world has enormous benefits, but it also has enormous dangers. Addiction, distraction, misinformation, cyberbullying, online scams, unrealistic lifestyles, constant comparison, and the endless pressure to remain connected. So Gen Z doesn't necessarily need older generations to say, "Everything online is good." Nor do they need them to say, "Everything online is bad." Perhaps what they really want is, "Help us understand how to use it wisely." And that begins with understanding the digital world before judging it. Imagine a parent seeing a young person watching videos for hours and immediately saying, "You're wasting your life." Perhaps sometimes they are, but what if that young person is learning a skill, building an audience, researching a subject, learning a language, working on a business, creating music, or simply connecting with people who share an interest they cannot easily find in their immediate surroundings? Without understanding the digital world, it can be difficult to distinguish between productive use and harmful use. And that is why conversation matters. Instead of simply asking, "Why are you always online?" perhaps ask, "What are you doing online?" Instead of, "That social media thing is useless." Perhaps ask, "What do you find useful about it?" Instead of immediately taking the phone away, perhaps discuss what makes it difficult to put the phone down. Because sometimes the problem isn't the technology itself. It is the way technology is being used. A smartphone can be a distraction, or a classroom. Social media can create insecurity, or create a community. The internet can waste time, or create opportunity. Artificial intelligence can replace certain tasks, or become a powerful tool for learning and creativity. The technology is powerful, but the wisdom to use it responsibly is even more important. And there is another side to the digital world that older generations may not always see. The pressure. Imagine constantly seeing other people's achievements, other people's relationships, other people's bodies, other people's holidays, other people's wealth, other people's seemingly perfect lives. And then looking at your own life, and feeling that you are falling behind. Gen Z may be connected to the entire world, yet still feel disconnected from themselves. They may have hundreds or thousands of online connections, and still experience loneliness. They may receive constant notifications, yet desperately want some peace and silence. This is one of the great contradictions of the digital age. We have never been more connected, and yet many people struggle to feel truly connected. Perhaps older generations can offer something incredibly valuable here: the ability to slow down, to put the phone away, to sit together, to talk without notifications, to enjoy a meal without recording it, to experience a moment without immediately sharing it. And Gen Z can offer something valuable in return: digital understanding. They can show older generations how technology can be used for learning, communication, creativity, business, and connection. This should not become a battle between real life and online life. The challenge is to learn how to live wisely in both. Because the digital world isn't going away. It will become even more powerful. Artificial intelligence will continue to evolve. Virtual experiences will become more sophisticated. Work and education will continue to change. And future generations will probably look back at today's technology the way we look back at yesterday's technology. So the answer cannot simply be, go offline. The deeper answer is, learn to control technology before technology begins controlling you. And perhaps this is what Gen Z wants from older generations: don't fear our digital world. Don't blindly trust it either. Understand it, ask questions, learn how it works, talk to us about its possibilities and its dangers. Because when older generations understand the digital world, they become better equipped to guide young people through it. And when Gen Z learns to step away from that world when necessary, they become better equipped to live fully within the real one. The goal is not to choose between technology and humanity. The goal is to make sure technology remains a tool in human hands and never becomes the master of human attention. Because perhaps the greatest digital wisdom of all is not knowing how to stay connected to everyone, but knowing when to disconnect and truly connect with the people sitting right beside you.
Point number 9. They don't want constant comparison. There is something almost every generation has experienced at some point: being compared with someone else. But for Gen Z, constant comparison can feel especially overwhelming. It may begin with something that sounds harmless. Look at your cousin. Why can't you be like your brother? When I was your age, I had already achieved this. Look at what other children are doing. Sometimes these words are meant to motivate. Parents and elders may believe that comparison encourages young people to work harder, become more disciplined, or aim higher. But comparison doesn't always create motivation. Sometimes, it creates insecurity. Imagine hearing again and again, someone else is doing better than you. Eventually, a young person may stop asking, "What can I become?" and start asking, "Why am I not good enough?" And there is a profound difference between those two questions. Gen Z is growing up in an age where comparison is no longer limited to the people living next door. Through social media, young people can compare themselves with thousands, even millions, of people every day. Someone is earning more, someone looks more attractive, someone has a better career, someone is traveling the world. Someone has millions of followers. Someone has bought a beautiful house. Someone seems to have the perfect relationship. Someone appears to have achieved everything at an incredibly young age. And then there is the young person sitting quietly with their own life, wondering, why am I so far behind? But there is a problem. We often compare our behind the scenes with someone else's highlight reel. We see their success, but not their failures. We see their confidence, but not their insecurities. We see the achievement, but not the years of struggle behind it. We see the photograph, but not the reality outside the frame. And when parents and elders add another layer of comparison at home, the pressure can become even greater. Look at him, look at her. Why can't you achieve what they have achieved? But every human being has a different starting point. Different abilities, different circumstances, different opportunities, different interests, different struggles, and different definitions of success. A person who becomes successful at 20 may not be more successful than someone who discovers their purpose at 35. Someone earning a large income may not necessarily be happier. Someone with an impressive career may be struggling privately. And someone moving slowly may actually be building something meaningful. Life is not a race with one finish line. So perhaps instead of asking, why aren't you like them? A better question is, who do you want to become? Instead of, why aren't you earning as much as your cousin? Ask, what are you doing to build the future you want? Instead of, look how successful that person is. Say, let's learn from their success without forgetting your own journey. That small change in language can make an enormous difference. Because there is a healthy form of comparison, and an unhealthy one. Healthy comparison says, what can I learn from this person? Unhealthy comparison says, why am I not this person? The first creates growth, the second can destroy self-worth. Gen Z doesn't need to be constantly reminded that someone else is ahead. They already know. What they need is encouragement to discover their own direction. They need to understand that progress doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes progress is simply getting back up. Sometimes it is learning a new skill. Sometimes it is overcoming fear. Sometimes it is becoming more responsible. Sometimes it is choosing not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And sometimes, progress is simply continuing when life feels difficult. Parents and elders have an important role here. They can become the people who say, don't worry about being ahead of everyone else. Focus on becoming better than you were yesterday. Imagine the difference between hearing, why can't you be like your cousin? And hearing, I believe you can become the best version of yourself. One creates pressure, the other creates possibility. And Gen Z also has a responsibility. Not every comparison comes from parents. Sometimes young people compare themselves constantly with people online. They need to remember, someone else's timeline is not a deadline for your life. You don't have to have everything figured out at 20. You don't have to achieve everything before 30. You don't have to live according to somebody else's definition of success. Your journey is yours, and perhaps one of the greatest forms of freedom is learning to say, I admire your journey, but I don't need to become you. So let us stop measuring young people only by their grades, their salary, their job, their appearance, their possessions, their followers, or the achievements of someone else. Measure them by their character, their effort, their integrity, their growth, their kindness, their resilience, their willingness to learn, because a young person who is slowly becoming a better human being may be achieving something far more valuable than what can be displayed on a resume or social media profile. Don't compare their chapter 5 with someone else's chapter 20. Let them write their own story. Because perhaps what Gen Z really wants to hear is not, why aren't you like them? But, I see your journey. Keep going, I believe in you. And sometimes, that simple change from comparison to encouragement can transform the way a young person sees themselves.
Point number 10. They want their opinions to matter. There is a fundamental human need that doesn't disappear simply because someone is young. The need to feel that your voice matters. And perhaps this is something Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand deeply. They don't expect everyone to agree with them. They don't expect their opinions to automatically be accepted. And they certainly don't believe that being young makes them right about everything. But they want something very simple. They want to be heard. Sometimes, when a young person expresses an opinion, the response is immediate. You're too young to understand. What do you know about life? You'll understand when you get older. We've already been through this. Perhaps the elder has more experience. Perhaps the young person's opinion really is incomplete. Perhaps they are even wrong. But being wrong does not mean their voice should be ignored. Because a person's age may determine how much life experience they have, but it does not determine whether they are capable of having a valuable idea. Gen Z has grown up in a world where information is available almost instantly. They can access different perspectives, cultures, scientific discoveries, technologies, and ideas from around the world. Sometimes they may know things their parents and elders have never encountered. And sometimes, they may misunderstand those things. That's perfectly normal. The important thing is to create a space where ideas can be discussed rather than immediately dismissed. Imagine a young person saying, "I think there is a better way to do this." There are two possible responses. The first, "We've always done it this way." The conversation ends. The second, "Interesting. Tell me why you think that." Now the conversation begins. That one question, "Tell me why," can communicate enormous respect. It says, "Your thoughts are worth hearing." And that doesn't mean the elder has surrendered their authority. It simply means they are willing to listen before deciding. There is also something beautiful that can happen when generations genuinely exchange ideas. The younger generation can bring fresh perspectives. The older generation can bring experience and wisdom. The young may ask questions that the older generation stopped asking long ago. The older generation may notice consequences that the younger generation has not yet considered. When these two perspectives meet with mutual respect, something powerful happens. Wisdom becomes richer, because wisdom is not merely knowing the answers. Sometimes wisdom is knowing when to listen to a different perspective. And Gen Z also has something important to learn here. Having an opinion does not automatically make that opinion correct. Freedom of expression comes with responsibility. A mature person should be able to say, "This is what I believe, but I could be wrong." They should be willing to listen, to examine evidence, to consider another perspective, to change their mind when they discover better information. That is not weakness, that is intellectual maturity. So the goal should never be, young people must always get their way. Nor, older people must always have the final word. The goal should be, let's listen to one another. In a healthy family, a young person's opinion can be heard, while an elder's experience can still be respected. A young person can say, "I disagree," without being disrespectful, and an elder can say, "I disagree with you," without making the young person feel insignificant. That is what healthy disagreement looks like. Because respect doesn't mean, "You agree with me." Respect means, "You allow me to have a voice." And sometimes, an opinion that initially sounds immature may contain an idea worth exploring. Perhaps a young person suggests a different way of studying, a different career path, a new technology, a different way of communicating, a new approach to family life, or simply a different way of looking at an old problem. Instead of immediately asking, "Who gave you this idea?" perhaps ask, "What made you think about it this way?" You might discover something valuable. And perhaps the greatest lesson for parents and elders is this: listening to a young person's opinion does not reduce your authority. In many cases, it strengthens your relationship. Because when young people know they can speak openly without being ridiculed or immediately dismissed, they are more likely to communicate honestly. And honest communication is one of the strongest foundations of trust. A young person who feels heard is more likely to listen. A young person who feels respected is more likely to respect. And a young person who feels that their voice matters is more likely to use that voice responsibly. So perhaps Gen Z is not asking, "Let us decide everything." They are asking, "Let us be part of the conversation. Let us express our thoughts. Let us ask questions. Let us disagree respectfully. Let us explain how we see the world. And if you believe we're wrong, talk to us, not down to us." Because generations don't become closer when one generation silences the other. They become closer when both sides are willing to listen. And perhaps, in the end, the most powerful words an elder can say to a young person are not, "You are too young to understand," but, "I may see things differently, but I want to hear what you think." Those words don't simply give a young person permission to speak. They give them something much more valuable, the feeling that their voice matters.
Point number 11. They want older generations to admit when they are wrong. There is something deeply powerful that can transform a relationship between generations. The ability to say, "I was wrong." For many young people, this matters enormously. Not because they expect their parents or elders to be perfect. Quite the opposite. They know that everyone makes mistakes. They make mistakes. Their parents make mistakes. Their grandparents made mistakes. Being human means sometimes getting things wrong. But when an elder refuses to acknowledge a mistake simply because they are older, something important can begin to break: trust. Imagine a young person explaining, "You misunderstood what I was trying to say." And instead of listening, the response is, "I'm older than you. I know better." Or perhaps an elder makes a decision that turns out to be wrong, but instead of acknowledging it, they say, I did what I thought was best. That may be understandable, but sometimes the most meaningful response would simply be, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Those 4 words can be extraordinarily powerful. They don't make an elder weaker. They don't destroy authority. They don't reduce respect. In fact, they can increase respect. Because when an elder admits a mistake, a young person learns something much more valuable than obedience. They learn accountability. They learn that being confident does not mean pretending to be perfect. They learn that changing your mind is not weakness. They learn that apologizing is not humiliation. And they learn that even people they look up to are capable of learning and growing. Consider a parent who says, I judged you too quickly. Imagine an elder saying, I didn't understand what you were trying to explain. Or simply, I was wrong about that. Those statements can completely change the atmosphere of a conversation. Because suddenly, the relationship becomes less about authority and more about humanity. There is also an important distinction here. Admitting that you were wrong does not mean agreeing with everything a young person says. It doesn't mean giving up your principles. It doesn't mean allowing disrespectful behavior. It simply means having the courage to recognize the truth when you discover it. An elder can still say, I disagree with your decision, while also saying, but I was wrong about what I assumed about you. That is maturity, and Gen Z needs to learn the same lesson. They too will be wrong. They too will make assumptions. They too will hurt people unintentionally. And they too will need to say, I was wrong. The principle should work in both directions. Because the goal isn't to create a generation that blames the older generation for everything. The goal is to create relationships where everyone is allowed to learn. Sometimes an elder may say, when I was young, I believed this was the right way. And then add, but I've learned something since then. That sentence carries enormous wisdom. It tells the younger generation, you don't have to repeat every mistake I made. And perhaps that is one of the greatest gifts an elder can give. Not the image of perfection, but the example of growth. Because young people don't need perfect parents. They need honest parents. They don't need elders who always have the right answer. They need elders who are willing to search for the right answer with them. And sometimes, the most memorable lesson a parent can teach isn't delivered through a lecture. It comes through a simple apology. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. I shouldn't have said that. I was wrong. These words can teach more about dignity and responsibility than years of advice. And there is another beautiful consequence. When an elder admits a mistake, it gives the young person permission to admit their own. The relationship becomes safer. A young person no longer feels that they must defend themselves simply to protect their dignity. Instead, both sides can say, let's figure out what went wrong. Rather than, who is going to win this argument? And perhaps that is what every generation needs. Not winners and losers, not parents versus children, not elders versus youth, but 2 human beings willing to learn from each other. Because age brings experience, but age does not make anyone infallible. And youth brings fresh perspectives, but youth does not make anyone automatically right. The wisest person in the room is not necessarily the oldest, nor is it necessarily the youngest. Sometimes, the wisest person is simply the one courageous enough to say, I was wrong. I understand it better now, and I'm willing to learn. That is not a loss of authority. That is the true strength of character.
Point number 12. They want space to make their own mistakes. There is a difficult truth about growing up. You cannot learn everything from someone else's mistakes. Sometimes, you have to make a few mistakes of your own. This can be particularly difficult for parents and elders to accept. After all, they have already experienced many of life's disappointments. They know what failure feels like. They know how painful poor decisions can be. They know the consequences of choosing the wrong career, trusting the wrong person, spending money carelessly, or taking a path that leads nowhere. So naturally, when they see a young person moving toward a decision that looks risky, their instinct is to say, don't do it. I've already told you this won't work. You'll regret it. And sometimes, they may be absolutely right. But there is a difference between protecting someone from a dangerous mistake and preventing someone from experiencing the ordinary mistakes through which maturity develops. Gen Z doesn't necessarily want freedom from guidance. They want space to learn. They want to discover what happens when they make a decision, take responsibility for it, face the consequences, and learn from the experience. Because some lessons cannot be taught through words. You can tell someone, don't waste your money. But managing their own limited money may teach them far more. You can say, choose your friends carefully. But sometimes experiencing disappointment teaches a lesson that no lecture can fully communicate. You can say, think carefully before choosing a career. But discovering one's strengths, weaknesses, interests, and limitations often requires exploration. This doesn't mean young people should be allowed to make every mistake imaginable. Absolutely not. There are mistakes that can cause serious or irreversible harm. There are situations where an elder must intervene. There are moments when protection must come before independence. But not every mistake is a disaster. Some mistakes are simply part of growing up. A failed attempt, a wrong decision, a rejected application, a business idea that didn't work, a career path that wasn't right, a friendship that ended, a plan that didn't go as expected. These experiences can be painful, but they can also become powerful teachers. Sometimes failure teaches responsibility. Sometimes disappointment teaches resilience. Sometimes embarrassment teaches humility. Sometimes a wrong decision teaches better judgment. And sometimes, a young person's biggest mistake becomes the experience that helps them make their best decision later in life. This is why there is a difference between saying, "I won't let you make that mistake," and saying, "I'm worried about this decision. Let's talk about the consequences, and then I'll support you as you make your choice." The second approach doesn't abandon the young person. It prepares them. It says, "I trust you enough to learn." And trust is essential for maturity. If every decision is made for a young person, how will they learn to make decisions themselves? If every problem is solved for them, how will they learn to solve problems? If every failure is prevented, how will they learn to recover from failure? And if every difficult experience is removed, how will they develop resilience? Growing up is not simply about becoming older. It is about becoming capable. And capability comes from experience. There is also something parents and elders may sometimes forget. Young people don't always need someone to rescue them from every consequence. Sometimes they need someone who remains nearby while they face those consequences. A parent can say, "I told you this might happen." But perhaps an even more helpful response is, "This didn't work out. What did you learn from it?" The first statement may produce shame. The second can produce wisdom. And there is enormous power in that difference. Because the purpose of making mistakes should not be to prove that someone was foolish. It should be to help them become wiser. Gen Z, however, has a responsibility here too. Having the freedom to make mistakes does not mean having freedom from responsibility. If you choose, own the choice. If you make a mistake, accept the consequence. If you hurt someone, apologize and make amends. If something fails, learn from it. Don't blame your parents for every poor decision simply because they gave you freedom. Freedom without responsibility is not maturity. True independence means accepting both the freedom to choose and the responsibility for what follows. And perhaps this is where generations can meet in the middle. Parents and elders can provide wisdom without domination, warnings without humiliation, guidance without control, and Gen Z can respond with responsibility without excuses, independence without arrogance, freedom with accountability. Imagine the message an elder can give. "I have told you what I believe. I have warned you about the risks. But ultimately, this is your decision. If you make a mistake, we'll deal with it together." That is not weakness. That is trust with boundaries. And perhaps one day, that young person will face a difficult decision alone. There will be no parent standing beside them. No elder giving instructions. No one telling them exactly what to do. At that moment, what will guide them? Not the number of rules they were given, but the judgment they developed through experience. So perhaps the greatest gift an elder can give is not a life without mistakes, but the confidence to face mistakes when they happen. Because young people don't need a perfectly protected life. They need the opportunity to build a capable life. Let them try. Let them question. Let them experiment. Let them occasionally fail. Let them learn. And when they fall, don't always say, "I told you so." Sometimes, simply offer a hand and say, "What did you learn, and what will you do differently next time?" Because the goal of raising the next generation is not to make sure they never fall. It is to help them learn how to stand up when they do.
Point number 13. They want emotional connection, not just material support. There is something every generation needs, regardless of age, education, wealth, or circumstances: emotional connection. And perhaps this is one of the deepest messages Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand. Providing food, paying school or college fees, buying clothes, giving a smartphone, supporting a career, or creating financial security are all important expressions of love. They matter. They should never be taken for granted. But material support, by itself, cannot satisfy every emotional need. Because a young person may have everything they need, and still feel that something is missing. They may have a comfortable home, but feel lonely inside it. They may have expensive possessions, but wish someone would simply sit down and ask, "How are you really feeling?" They may receive financial support, but still wonder, do they understand me? Do they know what I am going through? Can I talk to them without being judged? Do they actually enjoy spending time with me? This is the difference between providing for someone and being emotionally present for someone. A parent may work extremely hard to give their child a better life. That sacrifice deserves enormous respect. But sometimes, while working to build a better future for their children, they may unintentionally miss the present. The child grows older, the child becomes a teenager, then a young adult, and one day the parent looks around and realizes, when did my child grow up? Perhaps the answer is, while everyone was busy trying to build a better tomorrow, Gen Z may not always need another expensive gift. Sometimes they need something much less expensive and much more precious: time. Sit with them, listen to them, ask about their interests, watch something together, have a meal without everyone looking at their screens. Take a walk, talk about life, laugh together, and sometimes just be there without trying to solve anything. Because emotional connection is often created through small moments. A parent remembering something their child once said, an elder asking about an important day, a simple message, "I was thinking about you. How are you doing?" A hug when words aren't enough. A conversation late at night. A quiet cup of tea together. These moments may appear ordinary, but years later, they can become some of the most precious memories a person carries. And there is another important distinction. Young people don't necessarily want parents and elders to become their best friends. They still need guidance. They still need boundaries. They still need responsible adults in their lives. But they want to feel that behind the authority, there is affection. Behind the rules, there is understanding. Behind the advice, there is care. And behind the expectations, there is unconditional love. Sometimes a young person makes a mistake and expects a lecture. But what they may secretly need first is, "Are you okay?" The mistake can be discussed later. The consequences can be addressed later. But the emotional connection should not disappear in the process. Because when someone knows, even when I fail, I am still loved, they develop a sense of security that money cannot buy. This doesn't mean unconditional love should mean unconditional approval. A parent can say, "I love you, but I don't agree with what you did." An elder can say, "I am disappointed by your decision, but I am not giving up on you." Those words carry enormous emotional power. They separate the person from the mistake. And perhaps that is something Gen Z desperately needs to know. Your mistake does not make you unworthy of love. There is also a lesson for General Z: emotional connection cannot be demanded from one side alone. Young people must also make an effort to communicate. Parents cannot read minds. Elders cannot always understand modern pressures automatically. Sometimes the young person needs to say, "I don't need advice right now. I just need you to listen." Or, "I know you are trying to help, but this is what I actually need from you." Clear communication can prevent enormous misunderstandings. Because sometimes parents are showing love in the only way they learn to show it: through providing. And young people are looking for love in another form, through listening, presence, affection, and emotional understanding. Neither necessarily means that love is absent. Sometimes, the languages of love are simply different. And perhaps the beautiful solution is for both generations to learn each other's language. Older generations can learn, providing is important, but presence matters too. And Gen Z can learn, the sacrifices made for me may be another way of saying, "I love you." When both sides understand this, something changes. Material support becomes more meaningful because it is accompanied by emotional connection. And emotional connection becomes stronger because it recognizes the sacrifices behind material support. Ultimately, a young person may forget the exact phone they received, the clothes they wore, or the amount of money spent on them. But they may remember for decades, who listened to them when they were hurting, who believed in them when they doubted themselves, who sat beside them when they were afraid, who celebrated their small victories, who stayed when things became difficult. That is the kind of wealth that cannot be measured in money. So perhaps Gen Z isn't saying, "Don't provide for us." They are saying, "Please don't let providing for us replace being with us. Give us opportunities, but also give us your time. Give us guidance, but also give us understanding. Give us security, but also give us affection." Because a house can provide shelter. Money can provide comfort. Possessions can provide convenience. But emotional connection creates a sense of home. And perhaps, in the end, that is what every generation is searching for. Not simply someone who provides for them, but someone who makes them feel that they truly belong.
Point number 14. They want to be loved even when they disappoint you. Perhaps one of the deepest things Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand is this. They don't want love to disappear when they fail to meet your expectations. They know they will disappoint you sometimes. They will make mistakes. They may choose a career you didn't expect. They may make financial mistakes. They may fail an examination. They may make a decision you strongly disagree with. They may choose friends you don't approve of. They may say something hurtful. They may take a path that frightens you. And sometimes, they may simply fail. But behind all those possibilities is one fundamental human need. Please don't stop loving me because I disappointed you. There is a difference between being disappointed in someone's behavior and withdrawing love from the person. A parent can say, I am deeply disappointed by what you did. But the young person should still be able to hear, I love you, and we will work through this. Those two messages can exist together. Love does not require pretending that everything is acceptable, and accountability does not require emotional rejection. A young person needs to know that consequences exist. If they make a serious mistake, there may need to be consequences. If they break someone's trust, they may need to rebuild it. If they behave irresponsibly, they may need to take responsibility. But discipline should teach, what you did was wrong. It should not communicate, you are no longer worthy of love. That distinction can shape an entire life. Because when young people believe that love depends entirely on achievement, they may begin to live in fear. Fear of failing, fear of disappointing their parents, fear of admitting mistakes, fear of revealing problems, fear of saying, I don't know what I'm doing. And when fear becomes stronger than trust, young people may start hiding things. They may hide failures, hide financial problems, hide emotional struggles, hide relationships, hide mistakes. Not necessarily because they don't love their parents, but because they are afraid of what will happen when the truth comes out. And sometimes, the very thing parents fear most, losing communication with their child, begins because the child becomes afraid to be honest. Imagine instead a young person making a serious mistake and knowing, I can tell my parents the truth. They may still face consequences. They may still receive criticism. But they know, I won't lose their love. That knowledge creates something incredibly powerful, trust. And trust makes honesty possible. There is also an important lesson for General Z. Being loved unconditionally does not mean being free from responsibility. You cannot say, my parents should love me no matter what, and use that as an excuse to hurt people, avoid responsibility, or refuse to learn from mistakes. Real love should move in both directions. If you disappoint someone, have the courage to acknowledge it. Say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I understand why you are hurt. I will try to do better. Love gives you the safety to make mistakes. Responsibility gives you the courage to correct them. And when these two things exist together, a relationship becomes stronger. Parents and elders also need to remember something. Your child is not their achievements. They are not their examination results. They are not their salary. They are not their career. They are not their social status. They are not the number of awards they have won. And they are certainly not the mistakes they have made. A young person can fail, and still have enormous potential. They can make a terrible decision, and still become a remarkable human being. They can lose their way, and still find their direction. Sometimes the person who disappoints you today may become the person who makes you proud tomorrow. But they need the opportunity to grow. And growth requires room for mistakes. Perhaps one of the most powerful things a parent can say after a disappointing moment is, I am angry about what happened. I am disappointed by your decision. But nothing has changed the fact that you are my child, and I love you. That sentence doesn't excuse the mistake. It doesn't remove accountability. It simply makes one thing absolutely clear. The relationship is bigger than the mistake. And that can give a young person the courage to face what they have done instead of running away from it. Because sometimes, the fear of losing love is so painful that people spend years trying to prove they are worthy of it. But love should not have to be earned through perfection. A young person should not have to think, if I succeed, I am loved. If I fail, I am a disappointment. They need to know, my achievements may make you proud, but they are not the price of your love. And perhaps this is one of the greatest gifts parents and elders can offer. A safe place to return to. A place where success is celebrated, but failure is not the end. A place where mistakes are corrected, but dignity is preserved. A place where disagreement is possible, but love remains. Because one day, every young person will make a decision that doesn't work out. They will stumble, they will fail, they will disappoint someone, and when that day comes, what they remember may not be the lecture they received. They may remember whether someone looked at them and said, you made a mistake. But you are not a mistake. That message can stay with a person for a lifetime. Because perhaps the deepest form of parental love is not loving a child only when they make you proud, but remaining beside them while they learn how to become someone they can be proud of themselves.
Point number 15. And perhaps the older generation has something Gen Z desperately needs. After everything we have discussed about what Gen Z wants their parents and elders to understand, there is another side of the conversation that deserves equal attention. Because perhaps the older generation has something Gen Z desperately needs. And that something is not simply money. It is not technology. It is not authority. It is not even experience alone. It is something much deeper: perspective. The ability to look beyond the immediate moment and understand that life is a long journey. Gen Z has grown up in a world of speed. Instant messages, instant information, instant entertainment, instant results. Everything seems to happen quickly. But life doesn't always work that way. Some things take years. Trust takes years. Wisdom takes years. Financial security takes years. Strong relationships take years. Character takes years. And perhaps one of the greatest lessons older generations can offer is the ability to understand that not everything meaningful needs to happen immediately. They can teach Gen Z the power of patience. Not the patience of simply waiting, but the patience of continuing to work while waiting for results. Because there will be moments when the algorithm doesn't cooperate, the business doesn't succeed, the application gets rejected, the relationship doesn't work, the dream takes longer than expected. And during those moments, the ability to say, "Keep going. This is not the end of your story," can be priceless. Older generations have also experienced something that no amount of online information can completely replace: life itself. They have seen people change. They have experienced success and failure. They have watched relationships begin and end. They have made financial mistakes. They have faced uncertainty. They have lost opportunities. They have discovered that some things they once considered extremely important weren't nearly as important as they thought. And perhaps that is what experience gives you: the ability to distinguish what is urgent from what is truly important. Gen Z may sometimes feel that one failure is the end of everything. An older person may look at that same failure and say, "I know it hurts right now. But believe me, life can change." That isn't dismissal, that is perspective. A young person may think, "Everyone else is ahead of me." An elder may say, "Don't rush your life. You have more time than you think." A young person may think, "I have to succeed immediately." An elder may say, "Build something that lasts, even if it takes longer." And perhaps those are lessons worth hearing. But this does not mean Gen Z should simply accept everything older generations say. Experience can teach wisdom, but experience can also contain outdated assumptions. The world changes, technology changes, work changes, society changes, and younger generations will sometimes see possibilities that older generations cannot immediately recognize. So the answer isn't for Gen Z to blindly follow the older generation. And it isn't for the older generation to blindly follow General Z. The answer is, learn from each other. Because Gen Z has something the older generation needs too: fresh ideas, digital knowledge, new perspectives, creativity, adaptability, a willingness to question old assumptions, and the courage to imagine a different future. Imagine what happens when these strengths come together: the energy of youth, combined with the perspective of experience. The creativity of Gen Z, combined with the wisdom of age. New ideas, combined with hard-earned lessons. That isn't a generation gap. That is a generation bridge. Perhaps the older generation's greatest gift to Gen Z is not telling them exactly how to live. It is helping them understand something they may only discover much later. You don't have to experience every mistake yourself to learn from life. Sometimes someone else's experience can save you years of pain. Listen to the person who has already walked the road, not because they are always right, but because they may have noticed the obstacles you haven't seen yet. And perhaps Gen Z needs another lesson that the modern world sometimes forgets. Not everything valuable can be measured. Followers can be counted, money can be counted, views can be counted, degrees can be counted, achievements can be counted, but what about character, kindness, loyalty, peace of mind, family, integrity, wisdom? These things may not create impressive numbers on a screen, but they can determine whether a life feels meaningful. And perhaps older generations have learned this through experience. They know that possessions eventually lose their excitement. Titles eventually change. Trends eventually disappear. But the people you loved, the people you helped, the character you developed, and the memories you created can remain among the most valuable parts of your life. So perhaps Gen Z doesn't need older generations to tell them, you don't understand life. They need them to say, there are some things I have learned that may help you. And perhaps the older generation doesn't need Gen Z to say, your way is outdated. They need to hear, show us what you learned, and we'll decide what still applies to our world. That is how wisdom travels from one generation to another. Not through commands, not through criticism, not through superiority, but through conversation, humility, experience, and trust. Because every generation has something the other doesn't. Youth has time and possibility. Age has experience and perspective. Youth can imagine what could be. Age can remember what has been. And when these two perspectives meet with mutual respect, something extraordinary can happen. The younger generation doesn't have to repeat every mistake of the past. And the older generation doesn't have to fear every change in the future. They can walk forward together. Perhaps that is the real message of this entire conversation. Gen Z doesn't need older generations to become General Z, and older generations don't need Gen Z to become like them. They simply need to understand one another. Because the future belongs to the young, but the wisdom that helps them navigate that future may already exist in the generation standing beside them. And perhaps that is the greatest gift one generation can give another. Not control, not criticism, not comparison, but wisdom freely shared, and a future freely explored.
Point number 16. What if both generations stopped fighting? What if, for a moment, both generations stopped fighting? What if parents and elders stopped seeing Gen Z as disrespectful, lazy, impatient, or impossible to understand? And what if Gen Z stopped seeing older generations as outdated, controlling, judgmental, or incapable of understanding the modern world? What if both sides simply paused and asked, what are we really fighting about? Because beneath many arguments between generations, there may be something surprisingly similar. Both generations want to be respected. Both want to be heard. Both want to feel valued. Both want security. Both want meaningful relationships. Both want their loved ones to have a good life. And perhaps most importantly, both generations are afraid of losing each other. The older generation may fear that the values they worked so hard to preserve are disappearing. Gen Z may fear that their individuality and freedom are being taken away. The older generation may say, we are only trying to protect you. Gen Z may hear, you don't trust me. Gen Z may say, I need independence. The older generation may hear, you don't matter to me anymore. And suddenly, a conversation becomes an argument. Not because either side necessarily wants to hurt the other, but because the same words can carry completely different meanings for different generations. So what if we stopped trying to win every argument? What if being right became less important than being connected? Imagine a parent saying, help me understand why you see it differently. And a young person responding, let me understand why this matters so much to you. That single exchange could change everything. Because understanding doesn't require agreement. You can disagree and still respect. You can have different values and still love. You can choose different lifestyles and still remain connected. You can believe in different approaches and still learn from one another. Perhaps the real enemy isn't the older generation. And it isn't General Z. The real enemy is misunderstanding, miscommunication, assumptions, stereotypes, unspoken expectations, and the habit of judging before listening. What if instead of saying, your generation is ruining everything, we said, what is your generation trying to change? What if instead of, you people don't understand how the real world works, we said, what does the real world look like from your perspective? And what if Gen Z responded not with, you are completely out of touch, but, there are things about today's world that may be difficult to understand. Let me explain. That is how a generation gap becomes a generation bridge. And perhaps the greatest transformation would happen inside families. A parent would no longer feel that every disagreement is a challenge to their authority. A young person would no longer feel that every piece of advice is an attempt to control them. An elder could say, I don't agree with you, but I respect your right to think differently. And a young person could say, I don't agree with you, but I respect what your experience has taught you. Imagine that kind of relationship. Not perfect, not free from arguments, but built on mutual respect. Because stopping the fight doesn't mean pretending that differences don't exist. It means learning how to disagree without destroying the relationship. There will still be difficult conversations. There will still be mistakes. There will still be moments of frustration. But perhaps the question changes from, who is right, to, how can we understand each other? And that is a much more important question. Because eventually, every generation becomes the older generation. Today's Gen Z will one day have children of their own. They will have their own experiences, their own fears, their own expectations, and perhaps one day, they too will hear someone younger say, "You don't understand us." What will they remember then? The lessons they learned from today's generation gap. Perhaps they will remember that understanding cannot be demanded. It must be practiced. And perhaps they will choose differently. They will listen before judging. They will guide without controlling. They will correct without humiliating. They will give advice without assuming they know everything. And they will remember that love must survive disagreement. That is how change begins. Not with one generation defeating another, but with both generations deciding, we don't want to fight each other anymore. Because the older generation has something Gen Z needs. And Gen Z has something the older generation needs. Neither side has the complete answer. But together, they may have something much more valuable, a fuller understanding of life. So perhaps the million-dollar question isn't, which generation is better? It is, what could we accomplish if both generations stopped fighting and started listening? Imagine the possibilities. Less judgment, more conversation, less comparison, more encouragement, less control, more trust, less misunderstanding, more empathy, and perhaps, more love. Because generations are not supposed to compete for victory. They are supposed to pass wisdom forward, receive new ideas, and help one another move into the future. And maybe the greatest legacy we can leave behind isn't proving that our generation was right. It is creating a world where the next generation doesn't have to fight so hard to be understood. That would be a victory worth sharing.
Point number 17. The message Gen Z may really be trying to say. After everything we have discussed, perhaps there is one message beneath all the questions, frustrations, disagreements, and differences between generations. A message that may be difficult to express, but incredibly important to understand. Perhaps Gen Z is really trying to say, please don't judge us before you know us. We know we are different. We know we don't always think the way you think. We know we don't always choose the paths you chose. We know that sometimes our priorities may seem strange to you. But different does not necessarily mean disrespectful. Different does not necessarily mean lazy. Different does not necessarily mean irresponsible. It simply means different. Perhaps we are trying to say, listen to us before you lecture us. We don't expect you to agree with everything we say. We don't expect you to approve of every decision we make. But when we speak about our struggles, our dreams, our fears, our careers, our money, our relationships, or our future, please don't dismiss us simply because we are younger. Sometimes, we need your wisdom. But sometimes, we need your understanding first. Perhaps we are also saying, guide us, but don't control every step we take. We know you have experience. We know you have made sacrifices. We know many of your warnings come from love. And we are grateful for that. But there comes a point when guidance must slowly become trust. Because one day, we will have to make decisions without you standing beside us. Let us learn how to think. Let us make choices. Let us experience some mistakes. And when we fail, please don't make us feel that failure has made us unworthy. Instead, help us learn how to stand again. Perhaps we are saying, don't compare our journey with yours. The world we are growing up in is not exactly the world you grew up in. The opportunities are different. The challenges are different. Technology is different. The workplace is different. The cost of living is different. The pressures are different. So please don't measure our lives entirely by the standards of another era. Teach us what worked for you, but also allow us to discover what works for us. Perhaps we are saying, take our emotional struggles seriously. When we say we're overwhelmed, don't automatically tell us that someone else had it worse. When we say we're struggling, don't assume we're weak. Sometimes we don't need a solution immediately. Sometimes we simply need someone to listen. Someone to say, I understand. I'm here. Let's figure this out together. Perhaps we are saying, see us as individuals. Don't reduce us to the label General Z. We are not one personality. We don't all think alike. We don't all want the same things. We don't all share the same values. We are millions of individuals, each trying to understand who we are and what we want our lives to mean. So don't ask, what's wrong with your generation? Ask, what is your generation experiencing? That question changes everything. Perhaps we are also saying, we want our opinions to matter. Not because we believe we know everything, but because we want to participate in the conversation. We want to explain our perspective. We want to ask questions. We want to challenge ideas. And yes, sometimes we will be wrong. But allow us to be wrong without making us feel worthless. Because perhaps one of the greatest lessons we can learn from you is how to disagree respectfully. and one of the greatest lessons you can learn from us is how to remain curious about a changing world. Perhaps we are saying, we don't want your sacrifices to go unnoticed. We know many parents and elders worked incredibly hard to give their children opportunities they never had. We know that love is sometimes expressed through sacrifice rather than words. We know that the roof over our heads, the education we received, the food on our table, and the opportunities available to us, often came at a cost that we may not fully understand yet. So perhaps what we need is not to reject your values, but to understand the sacrifices behind them. And perhaps we are saying something even deeper. We want to be loved even when we disappoint you. We don't want to be loved only when we succeed, only when we make you proud, only when we follow the path you chose. We want to know that when we fail, when we make mistakes, when we lose our way, there is still a place where we belong. Because knowing that someone will remain beside you when life becomes difficult, can give you the courage to face life honestly. And perhaps, this is the message beneath everything. We don't want to replace you. We want to understand you, and we want you to understand us. We don't want a war between generations. We don't want to erase the past. We don't want to reject everything you taught us. We simply want to take the wisdom that belongs to the past, combine it with the possibilities of the present, and build a better future. Because perhaps the future should not belong exclusively to General Z, and it should not belong exclusively to the older generation. It should be something we build together. So if Gen Z could express everything in one message, perhaps it would sound something like this. Listen to us. Trust us, guide us, respect us, correct us when we are wrong, give us room to grow, don't compare us, don't give up on us, and above all, please try to understand us before you judge us. And perhaps the older generation has a message of its own. We may not always understand your world. But we love you. We have made mistakes too. We may sometimes hold on too tightly because we are afraid of losing you. We may give advice when you only wanted us to listen. But we are willing to learn. And perhaps, that is where the generation gap begins to disappear. Not when one generation wins. Not when one generation changes completely. But when both sides finally realize, we are not enemies. We are family. We are human beings trying to understand one another. And perhaps that is the real message Gen Z may be trying to say. Don't just raise us. Understand us. Don't just protect us. Trust us. Don't just provide for us. Connect with us. And don't just tell us how to live. Walk with us while we discover how to live. Because generations may change, technology may change, the world may change, but one thing will never change. Every generation wants to be heard, respected, understood, and loved. And perhaps, that is where the conversation between generations should truly begin.
Point number 18. The bridge between generations. Perhaps after everything we have discussed, one question remains. How do we actually bring these two generations closer? How do we build a relationship where Gen Z feels understood, while parents and elders feel respected? The answer may be simpler than we think. We build a bridge, not a bridge that forces one generation to cross over and become like the other, but a bridge that allows both generations to meet somewhere in the middle. Because a generation gap is not necessarily a problem. It is a natural consequence of time. Every generation grows up under different circumstances. The world changes, technology changes, values evolve, priorities shift, and new challenges appear. But differences don't have to create distance. They can create an opportunity to learn. The older generation can bring experience, patience, discipline, perspective, resilience, wisdom earned through real-life experience. Gen Z can bring fresh thinking, creativity, adaptability, digital knowledge, curiosity, the courage to question what no longer works. Imagine putting those strengths together. The older generation says, "This is what life has taught us." And Gen Z responds, "This is what the world is becoming." Instead of arguing about which perspective is correct, they ask, "What can we learn from both?" That is the beginning of a bridge. A bridge is built one piece at a time. And the first piece is listening. Not listening while preparing your next argument. Not listening simply to find something to criticize. But listening with genuine curiosity. The second piece is respect. Respect does not mean agreement. It means recognizing that another person has the right to see the world differently. The third piece is trust. Parents and elders must gradually trust young people with responsibility. And young people must demonstrate that freedom can be handled responsibly. The fourth piece is communication. Instead of assuming, "I know exactly what you mean," ask, "Help me understand what you mean." Instead of saying, "You never listen to me," say, "I feel unheard when this happens." Instead of, you don't understand anything about our world. Say, there are some things about today's world I'd like to explain. Small changes in language can create enormous changes in relationships. And perhaps the most important piece of the bridge is empathy. Older generations need to remember what it felt like to be young, to have dreams, to make mistakes, to be uncertain, to want independence, to feel misunderstood. And Gen Z needs to remember that today's parents and elders were once young too. They also had dreams. They also made mistakes. They also struggled with uncertainty. They simply grew up in a different world. Perhaps neither generation needs to say, "You don't understand me." Instead, both can say, "Help me understand you." That one change turns a confrontation into a conversation. And perhaps the bridge becomes strongest when both generations become willing to admit, "I don't know everything." That is a powerful sentence. An elder can say, "I don't understand this technology. Teach me." A young person can say, "I haven't experienced what you have. Tell me what you learned." Suddenly, nobody has to pretend to know everything. Everyone becomes a learner. And perhaps that is the kind of relationship we need. A relationship where the older generation doesn't have to surrender its wisdom, and Gen Z doesn't have to surrender its individuality. Where elders can guide without controlling. Where young people can question without disrespecting. Where mistakes can become lessons rather than weapons. Where disagreements don't become permanent divisions. Where love remains stronger than differences. Because ultimately, the goal isn't to eliminate the generation gap. That may be impossible. The goal is to make the gap crossable. A bridge doesn't erase the distance between two sides. It simply makes it possible to travel between them. And perhaps that is exactly what generations need. A way for wisdom to travel from the past into the future, and for fresh ideas to travel from the future back toward the present. A way for grandparents to understand grandchildren. For parents to understand their children. For young people to understand where their elders came from. And for everyone to realize that they are part of the same human story. One generation carries the memories of yesterday. Another carries the possibilities of tomorrow. And somewhere between them lies today. This moment, this opportunity. The opportunity to listen before judging. To understand before criticizing. To guide before controlling. To forgive before resentment grows. To appreciate before someone is gone. And perhaps that is the most important bridge of all. The bridge built through love. Because when love is present, differences become easier to discuss. When respect is present, disagreements become easier to survive. When trust is present, independence becomes less frightening. And when communication is present, misunderstanding loses its power. So perhaps the question isn't, how can Gen Z become more like the older generation? And it isn't, how can the older generation become more like Gen Z? The better question is, how can both generations become better at understanding each other? That is the bridge. And every conversation that begins with genuine listening, every apology, every moment of patience, every attempt to understand, adds another piece to it. Because one day, today's Gen Z will become tomorrow's older generation. And when that happens, they will inherit the responsibility of building the next bridge. So let us build this one carefully. With respect, with patience, with wisdom, with curiosity, with understanding, and above all, with love. Because generations were never meant to live on opposite sides of a divide. They were meant to learn from one another, support one another, and move forward together. And perhaps, the bridge between generations begins with one simple decision. I may not understand your world yet, but I am willing to listen.
Final reflection, a message to both generations. After everything we have explored in this conversation, perhaps the most important realization is this. Neither generation has all the answers. Gen Z has its own challenges. The older generation has its own experiences. One has grown up in a rapidly changing digital world. The other has lived through a world that changed in very different ways. One looks toward the future with new possibilities. The other carries lessons from the past. And perhaps, both perspectives are valuable. To the older generation, Gen Z does not need you to understand everything immediately. They don't expect you to know every technology, every trend, every new career, or every change taking place in their world. But they do need you to listen. Listen before judging, understand before criticizing, guide before controlling, and remember that the young people you are looking at today are growing up in circumstances you may never have experienced. Don't compare their journey with yours. Don't measure their worth only by traditional definitions of success. And when they make mistakes, correct them without making them feel that they have lost your love. Sometimes, the greatest thing you can give them is not another lesson, but the confidence to say, I believe you can figure this out. And to Gen Z, Your parents and elders may not always understand your world. They may sometimes ask questions that seem outdated. They may give advice you didn't ask for. They may worry too much. They may compare your life with theirs. And sometimes, they may genuinely get things wrong. But remember something important. Many of their actions come from experience, sacrifice, concern, and love. They may express that love differently from the way you expect. They may not always say, "I'm proud of you." But perhaps they worked long hours because they wanted you to have opportunities they never had. They may not always say, "I'm worried about you." But perhaps their criticism is sometimes fear disguised as advice. That doesn't mean every action is right. It simply means, try to understand the love behind the imperfect expression of it. And to both generations, please stop keeping score. Stop asking, who has sacrificed more? Who works harder? Who understands life better? Whose generation is better? These questions create winners and losers, when what we really need is understanding. Because at the end of the day, both generations are trying to do something remarkably similar: build a meaningful life. They simply have different ideas about how to get there. So perhaps we need fewer lectures and more conversations. Less comparison and more encouragement. Less judgment and more curiosity. Less control and more trust. Less criticism and more empathy. And perhaps most importantly, less distance and more connection. Because one day, today's young people will become the older generation. They will have their own children. They will have their own experiences. They will have their own ideas about what is right and wrong. And they may eventually hear the words, "You don't understand us." When that day comes, perhaps they will remember this moment. Perhaps they will remember what it felt like to be misunderstood. And perhaps they will choose to listen. That is how generations change. Not simply through technology. Not simply through education, but through understanding passed from one generation to another. So if there is one message worth carrying forward from this entire discussion, perhaps it is this. Gen Z doesn't need older generations to become General Z, and older generations don't need Gen Z to become like them. They need something better. They need each other. The older generation has wisdom that shouldn't be lost. Gen Z has ideas that shouldn't be ignored. The older generation carries memories of where we came from. Gen Z carries possibilities for where we might go. And between those two, there is an opportunity. An opportunity to build a future where experience and innovation work together. Where tradition and change can coexist. Where independence doesn't mean disconnection. Where guidance doesn't become control. Where disagreement doesn't become rejection. And where love remains stronger than differences. Because ultimately, a generation is not defined only by its age. It is defined by what it chooses to pass forward. So let us pass forward the best of what we have learned. Let us keep the wisdom, but question the outdated assumptions. Let us embrace technology, but protect our humanity. Let us encourage ambition, but remember that life is more than achievement. Let us value independence, but never forget the importance of family and connection. Let us allow people to make mistakes, while teaching them responsibility. And let us remember that behind every generation, there are simply human beings trying to be understood.
The ultimate message we all need to hear. Perhaps, after everything we have said about Gen Z, parents, elders, differences, expectations, struggles, mistakes, and the generation gap, there is one truth that rises above all of it. We are all human beings before we are members of a generation. Before we are Gen Z, before we are parents, before we are elders, before we are young or old, we are people with hearts that can be hurt, minds that can become confused, dreams that can be broken, and souls that simply want to be understood. Perhaps that is what we sometimes forget. We become so busy defending our generation that we forget to understand the person standing in front of us. We say, "Your generation doesn't understand." They say, "You don't understand life." And somewhere between those two statements, a relationship begins to suffer. But what if we stopped? What if we stopped trying to prove who is right, and started trying to understand why the other person feels the way they do? What if an elder said, "Tell me what I am missing," and Gen Z said, "Tell me what life has taught you"? Imagine that conversation. No labels, no accusations, no comparisons, no generation trying to defeat another. Just two human beings, listening. Because sometimes, the person we are arguing with is not our enemy. They may simply be someone who loves us, but doesn't know how to express that love in the way we need. A parent may become controlling because they are afraid. An elder may become critical because they are worried. A young person may become distant because they feel misunderstood. Another may become defensive because they feel constantly judged. And beneath all these behaviors, there may be something very simple: please understand me. Perhaps this is what both generations are really saying. The older generation may be saying, please don't forget everything we sacrificed for you. And Gen Z may be saying, please don't forget that we are trying to build a life of our own. Both messages deserve to be heard. Because love should not demand that one generation completely surrender to another. Love should create room for both to exist. The older generation should not have to abandon its wisdom. Gen Z should not have to abandon its individuality. Instead, wisdom can guide innovation. Experience can encourage ambition. Tradition can coexist with change. And independence can coexist with family. That is not compromise. That is maturity. And perhaps maturity is what every generation eventually has to learn. To know when to speak, and when to remain silent. When to guide, and when to let someone discover. When to correct, and when to comfort. When to hold on, and when to let go. Because sometimes, love means holding someone close. And sometimes, love means giving them enough space to find their own way. There is another truth we should never forget: time is not waiting for us. The child who seems difficult today will one day be an adult. The parent who seems overly strict today will one day become older. The grandparent whose advice sometimes feels repetitive will not always be there to give it. And one day, the conversations we take for granted today may become memories. So why waste precious years on unnecessary resentment? Why allow pride to keep us silent? Why wait for someone else to make the first move? Why not say, I'm sorry? Why not say, I understand now? Why not say, tell me more? Why not say, I may not agree with you, but I respect you? And most importantly, why not say, I love you? Sometimes those 3 words can heal years of distance. Not every disagreement needs a winner. Not every mistake needs to be remembered forever. Not every difference needs to become a division. Some things are simply not worth losing a relationship over. Because at the end of life, we may discover that the argument we were determined to win was never worth the love we allowed ourselves to lose. And perhaps that is one of life's deepest truths. People matter more than pride. Relationships matter more than being right. Understanding matters more than winning. And love, when it is genuine, should be stronger than a difference of opinion. To the older generation, give Gen Z your wisdom, but don't give them only your fears. Tell them what life has taught you, but allow them to discover what life will teach them. Correct them when necessary, but don't make them afraid to come to you when they fail. And when they choose a different path, remember, different does not always mean wrong. To Gen Z, embrace your independence, but don't confuse independence with rejecting everyone who came before you. Question old ideas, but do it with humility. Choose your own path, but remember the sacrifices that helped make your choices possible. And when an elder gives you advice you don't need, perhaps you don't have to accept it. But you can still say, I understand why you're concerned. Sometimes respect costs nothing, but means everything. And to both generations, listen more. Judge less. Compare less. Forgive sooner. Appreciate more. Love openly. Because no generation gets unlimited time. One day, Gen Z will become the older generation. They will have their own children. Their own fears. Their own expectations. Their own ideas about what is right. And perhaps they will finally understand something that can only be understood with time. Every generation thinks it is protecting the future. The older generation protects it with experience. The younger generation protects it with change. But the future becomes truly better when experience and change learn to work together. So perhaps the generation gap doesn't need to disappear. Perhaps it simply needs a bridge. A bridge built with listening instead of judging, trust instead of control, guidance instead of domination, respect instead of comparison, and love instead of pride. And perhaps that bridge can begin today. Not tomorrow. Not when someone changes. Not when someone apologizes first. Today, with one conversation, one question, one act of patience, one sincere apology, one moment of listening, one expression of love. Because sometimes, one small change in the way we treat each other can change an entire relationship. And perhaps that is the ultimate message we all need to hear. We don't have to be the same to love one another. We don't have to agree to respect one another. We don't have to understand everything to care. And we don't have to choose between generations when we can learn from both. The past needs the future. The future needs the wisdom of the past. And the present needs both. So let us stop asking, which generation is better? And start asking, what can we learn from each other? Let us stop saying, you don't understand me. And start saying, help me understand you. Let us stop waiting for the other generation to change first, and become the generation that chooses to change the conversation. Because ultimately, we are not here forever. Our years are limited, our time together is precious. And when all the labels disappear, when the arguments are forgotten, when the generations become nothing more than chapters in history, what will remain? Perhaps only this: how we treated one another, how we loved, how we listened, how we forgave, how we made people feel. So before you walk away from someone you love, pause. Before you judge, listen. Before you criticize, understand. Before you say, they will never change, remember, you may be the person who can change the conversation. And before it becomes too late, say what your heart has been waiting to say. I understand you, I respect you, I forgive you, I am proud of you, and I love you, because perhaps, that is the ultimate wisdom. Not that we finally learned how to win every argument, but that we finally learned which arguments were never worth having. Not that we became identical, but that we learned to appreciate our differences. Not that one generation defeated another, but that both generations learned to walk forward together. And if there is one sentence you remember from this entire video, let it be this: different generations, different journeys, different perspectives, but one human family, and perhaps that is the bridge we should all choose to build.
If this message made you think differently about your own generation, or the generation around you, please like this video, share it with someone who may benefit from it, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you value meaningful conversations about life, wisdom, relationships, personal growth, and the lessons that truly matter, consider subscribing to Deep Wisdom. Because sometimes, one idea can change a perspective, one conversation can change a relationship, and one moment of understanding can bring two generations closer together. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey into deep wisdom, keep learning, keep understanding, keep growing.